Beginning a brand new section here. This is number 10, and we're going to talk about the Cold War. The problem with talking about the Cold War and condensing it into something easy to understand is you have to chop it up into all these different parts. So here is a really good example of what I told you way back in the beginning, that I'm less concerned with you memorizing dates and more understanding how things fit together. It's kind of a larger puzzle piece of themes and ideas and how these interplay of things, fears and ideas about the way the world works influence each other and change people's lives. Now there are some days that you're obviously going to want to remember, and I'll point those out very specifically as we go along, but generally speaking, I'm much more satisfied if you can understand how things happened and the influence that they have on each other than if you can just memorize a bunch of dates. World War II really doesn't end until August of 1945 with the surrender of Japan. And judging by what you see here and lots of other photographs, people just go crazy. I mean, the whole world is ecstatic, basically, that this unbelievable bloodletting has finally come to an end. And even people that are have been defeated, people in Germany, they're still going on record as saying that they're glad the war is over, that this can finally be a time when people move on with life and get back to other pursuits. And some of that is definitely true. The problem with the end of World War II is it doesn't stop conflict. In fact, all it does is really usher in the beginning of an even worse conflict, not in terms of body counts, but in terms of the economic and emotional and social damage that it does to not only the United States but the entire world. And there's a meeting of the leaders of the Allied nations at a place called Yalta in February of 1945. And the idea behind this meeting is these guys are going to get together and they're going to hash out what really is going to take place. What is the world going to look like after the World War is over? And the problem with Yalta is that it is a failure. So there's a failure to finalize any real decisions about what happens to places in Europe that are occupied. There's no real clear picture about what to do with governments that have been in exile all over the world. There's no clear picture about what to do with refugees in all of these occupied areas. There's questions about what to do with, former colonies. So Great Britain it was the empire that the sun never set, right? And parts of it, in fact, the bulk of the British Empire had been occupied in the Pacific by somebody else. And then the United States comes along and reconquers all of this stuff. So huge chunks of former imperial possessions are no longer under the control of the original colonial powers. And what's going to happen to these things? And there's kind of a general agreement going all the way back to the Atlantic Charter, which we talked about last time, about people being able to choose their own destiny, etc., etc. But I suggest that what you should really do is consider what's going on. Look at this picture for a second. So you've got Stalin on the right-hand side, FDR in the center, and Winston Churchill on the left. And look, just read the body language of these men. These are not people that are really looking as if they're even comfortable with each other anymore. And certainly, as FDR being the head of the United States and enjoying all of the success that the United States is having in the war, is unable to reconcile all of these desires and wishes that were initially part of the Allied program with the fact that now the Soviet Union is in control of basically all of Eastern Europe, from what was Russia right on up to, Berlin itself. And what do you do with a country as powerful as the Soviet Union that is looking at continued occupation of Eastern Europe as a way of expanding its influence and as a way of creating a buffer zone, a security zone to protect itself? And FDR had basic or some basic faith in Stalin. He understood that Stalin was a brutal dictator and kind of cut from the same cloth as Hitler in terms of violence and willingness to destroy, to maintain power. But he also felt like politically Stalin could be somebody that could be dealt with in terms of he could be brought to the table and decisions could eventually be made that would benefit the Soviet Union, would guarantee peace and safety. They just had to get to the end of the war and make sure that these things actually happened. The problem is that FDR does not survive to the end of the war. He dies in April 1945 in White Springs, Georgia. And the photograph here is not cliche. You often see it, well, you're going to see it in every single documentary ever made about FDR, but people are legitimately traumatized by the death of FDR. There's basically a whole generation of people in the United States that do not remember any president other than FDR. And there's an older generation that remembers back to Hoover and maybe even before, and they're looking at FDR as this figure, as someone who saved their lives, who establishes programs that keep them safe, and who rescues the United States from just total collapse during the Great Depression. And this image of FDR as this kind of great statesman and savior for a lot of people's lives has a tremendous impact. And not only emotionally and socially speaking in the United States, but you're also losing an incredibly powerful politician, someone who's got natural faith in people and believed that he could work politically with someone like Joseph Stalin. After the death of FDR, Vice President Harry S. Truman is sworn into office, and this is, of course, another one of those episodes that really says a testament to the American style of Republican democracy, in that you can have a president die in the middle of a world war with millions of soldiers committed and billions of dollars of material spread all over the planet, and you can still have a peaceful transition of government. It's actually amazing to think about in historical terms. The fact that over and over and over again, the United States can be in total turmoil socially or economically, and there's still this peaceful transition of government. That's kind of an aside. Harry S. Truman, while he is a politician, is not of the same caliber of politician as FDR. And that's not meant to be an insult. He just simply doesn't have the experience or kind of personal ideas about the way the world works that Roosevelt did. And consequently, he's totally unprepared to deal with someone like Stalin, who is a very brutal dictator and is willing to risk conflict and to bring about confusion and more war to provide these things for his own country. You also have to remember something about Truman. Truman served in World War I. He was an artillery officer. And at the end of World War I, as you should have read in the textbook, there's a separate peace between Germany and the Russians. And so a fighting soldier, like Truman would have been, would have an automatic mistrust of the Soviets as somebody who's willing to make a separate peace to save their own skin and get out of the war. Now, how obvious this feeling would have been to Truman is a subject of much debate. But there's still going to be this little zygote of an idea somewhere in the back of his mind, someplace where he's not entirely trusting of the idea of the Soviets, certainly not their style of government, and he's already had this experience of being, kind of stabbed in the back, if you will. That's a bad phrase, but kind of the Allies being betrayed by the Soviets once before, creating this bad blood. And so now you have a person who's in charge, who's being expected to make political decisions and deal with somebody like Stalin, who's already got, he doesn't have the same kind of background, and he doesn't have the same kind of relationship that FDR had with the man. So he's already kind of at a disadvantage in terms of dealing with the Soviets. In February of 1946, the ambassador to Russia, George Kennan, writes a telegram. As the Soviet Union is becoming more and more difficult to deal with politically, Truman is searching around for somebody who knows something about the Soviet Union. Obviously, they turned to the Russian ambassador. And to condense this long telegram, and they call it the long telegram because it's 8,000 words, which is huge if you think about, you know, the old style telegram coming through some little wire from across the ocean. But basically, Kennan says that really the only thing that the Soviet Union, the Russian, will respect in terms of politics is force, is being strong enough that you can't be intimidated, that you can't be overwhelmed, and being willing to project that force in a way that causes them to respect your power. And this idea begins to influence the way the United States deals with communism and the Soviet Union. Now, George Kennan absolutely loathed communism. And, you know, as the ambassador to Russia for all those years, he had quite a bit of experience with it. But his kind of personal disgust with communism colors his ideas and consequently colors the politics that come out of the advice he gives to people like Truman. And out of the long telegram comes certain ideas, one of them being the idea of containment, meaning force can be applied in different ways, and one of the ways you can apply that force is by stopping communism from spreading someplace else. So we're not going to go invade Russia. We're not going to go attack Soviet interests in Eastern Europe, but what we are going to do is stop them from spreading any further. We're going to contain them. So henceforth, if the Soviet Union tries an aggressive move into a new country, we're going to help the people that are being attacked, that are being invaded, and stop the spread of communism, not necessarily try and destroy it. And of course, this idea of containment it sounds like an attack to the Soviets. It sounds like a very disturbing idea. But this idea of containment basically becomes the U.S. policy for 40 some odd years during the Cold War. After World War II, the United States can no longer conduct business or act as if it is able to separate itself from world affairs. The United States is too completely linked to Europe in terms of alliances, but also in terms of being against other different aggressive political systems like communism. And a really good example of how this plays out in 1948 is the Marshall Plan, named after George C. Marshall. And Marshall is an old school politician who's a general, and he comes up with this economic plan to rebuild Europe. And eventually the Marshall Plan ends up being worth something like $13 billion to Europe. And a lot of it goes into infrastructure, rebuilding everything that they've just spent the last several years destroying in World War II. And this money is available, money and assistance is available to all of these nations. And you can see in the little propaganda poster there, all of the nations represented. Turkey, Italy, Switzerland, Germany even, Norway, France, all of these places being represented. And you'll notice there's one flag that is suspiciously absent from that, and that is, of course, the flag of the Soviet Union. Now, Soviets are offered assistance under the Marshall Plan, but the Soviets cannot accept that assistance from the United States without proving to the world that their system is inferior to capitalism, because they have to accept a handout to survive in the post-war years. So again, you have the United States wrapped up in the affairs of Europe, and something as simple as, at the end of the day, I mean, let's be very honest about the Marshall Plan. At the end of the day, the United States doesn't want Europe to be completely a hollowed out broken shell, because who in the hell is going to buy American products if there's total chaos and disruption in world markets? So it benefits the United States to rebuild Europe. I mean, that's obvious. So say whatever you want about the morality of it. That's completely irrelevant from our perspective as historians. But you can see how the United States is wrapped up in all of these world affairs, and this having an influence upon the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States. And this is a painting of Joseph Stalin. The CIA jokingly referred to him as Uncle Joe, somewhat disrespectfully, of course, but Stalin is in charge of the Soviet Union all during World War II and in the immediate post-war years. He's interpreting things like the Marshall Plan as a direct threat to Soviet power, as a direct threat to the security of the Soviet Union, the physical security of the Soviet Union, kind of a military and economic combination. And in order to begin to preserve the power of the Soviet Union and defend it, he starts to act aggressively in the post-war years. One of these would be the blockade of Berlin, which we can talk about in just a second. And the blockade of Berlin becomes a bargaining tool that he can use in meeting with the Western powers to put pressure on them to relax sanctions, to accept the Soviet Union as a political equal, and things like that. And this does go back to, I mean, in some ways it confirms some of these fears that Kennan had started with the long telegram, right? That the Soviet Union was willing to do all of these things and meddle in the affairs of other nations if it thought it could provide a better situation politically or economically or militarily even for itself. And I'm just using the Berlin blockade as a kind of case study of this. So this map shows Germany after the war, and you can see there's all of these Allied flags all over the map. And what happens is, in order to avoid a repeat of what happened after World War I, it's decided that Germany will be occupied by the Allies for the foreseeable future to keep them from rearming, to keep another Hitler from rising to power and starting this whole thing all over again. And you can see parts of Germany are occupied by France, the United States, and Great Britain, but also a gigantic chunk of Germany is occupied by the Soviet Union. And the problem is that little pink area right in the middle with the circle with all the flags in it, that's Berlin. That's the capital of Germany, and it's inside the Soviet zone. And so what the Soviet Union does is it cuts off all access to Berlin, starts a blockade of the city in order to kind of force the United States, France, Great Britain, and all of the other allied nations to kind of recognize the things that the Soviet Union is calling for. And the big one is the Soviet Union wants a buffer zone between itself and Germany. And let's step back in time for a moment. So during World War I, what happens? Germany invades Russia. What happens in World War II? Germany invades Russia. They go through Poland every single time to do this. So in order to protect itself, the Soviet Union wants to have friendly governments in places like Poland, which is occupied at this time, and it wants to have a huge chunk of space, physical land area between Germany and Russia. So if Germany ever gets itself back together again and decides, yeah, we're going to go attack Russia again, they've got to pass through these friendly territories of Czechoslovakia and Poland to get to Russia proper. So if you think about it, I mean, this is not an absolutely unreasonable fear of the Soviet Union. It's happened 2 times in a row in a single generation that they've been attacked and invaded by Germany. It's not unreasonable to think that a rearmed and powerful Germany might decide to do it all over again. Of course, the Allies are not going to allow communism to set up puppet governments all over the face of the earth to establish this buffer zone. So there's a fundamental disconnection between keeping and holding these occupied territories and being able to establish a security buffer. There's a disconnection in between the politics of the Allies and Soviet Russia. And this is, of course, what's generating a lot of this conflict as we're going into the early years of the Cold War. So essentially, I mean, if you get out a dictionary and you look up the term blockade, it's more of a military term than anything else. But the blockade of the city of Berlin is really a political blockade. They're putting pressure on this city in the occupied zone inside Germany, deep inside Germany, as a way of pressuring the Allies to respond in other ways, to recognize their power in the Pacific, to recognize their right to have a buffer zone, etc., etc. So they shut off all road access, ground access to the city of Berlin. And this results in a really unique episode of U.S. history where the United States starts flying supplies over the occupied zone into the city of Berlin. And a lot of these planes become known as the candy bombers. And I'll explain that in just a second. But it's not just candy that these planes are carrying. They're carrying everything, the stuff of life. So they're carrying coal to heat homes. They're carrying food. They're carrying medical supplies. You have to remember that places like Berlin were essentially reduced to toothpicks, rubble in the fighting during World War II. And all of the infrastructure in these places is completely obliterated. So to blockade the city of Berlin is denying these civilians that are still in the city access to very basic foodstuffs and material that they need to sustain life. And of course, if you're going to use these essentially defenseless civilians as bargaining chips politically, and the United States can offer them a little bit of relief, it becomes a political victory for the United States to break the blockade of Berlin. In this photograph, you can see people lined up in the near the end of the flyovers where the planes would come in over Berlin. You can see also in the photograph that the city is just destroyed. It's just bombed out buildings, it's just rubble everywhere. These planes would fly over, and they get the name the candy bomber because some of the pilots, seeing kids in these crowds as they would fly over, they take little bags of candy and they tie little tiny handmade cloth parachutes to them, and they drop them out the window of the cockpit as they would fly over. And so the kids were getting these little bags of candy from the American planes, and they were, that's how they get the name the candy bombers. And this episode with these German civilians becomes a huge political success for the United States, because here you have what looks like these communist, brutal Soviets that are victimizing people that have already been victimized by this horrible war, and the Allies are the ones that are trying to do everything they can to provide them with some relief, right up to the point of dropping candy on them. But this sends a couple of messages too. It sends a message to the USSR that the United States and the Allies are not just going to turn their back and let the Soviet Union do whatever the hell it wants, wherever the hell it wants, that there's actually going to be a response in some way. And here again, this episode with the candy bombers, this is not the United States turning around and lashing out and attacking the Soviet Union, dropping bombs all over Moscow, but it's still a response to what is perceived as Soviet aggression. The Soviets think they're acting entirely reasonably with their demands, and they're just trying to get people to see it. And of course, there's this miscommunication that we've already talked about. And over the long duration of the Cold War, Berlin becomes a bargaining chip over and over and over again, with the creation of the Berlin Wall, with the fall of the Berlin Wall. It becomes this symbol where you apply pressure or you take a pressure away, depending on how the Cold War is going. It becomes almost a source of another type of language that the superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States and her allies, can use to communicate with each other. Maladaptively, admittedly, but still a way that these superpowers can engage in economic and political dialogue without having to resort to using nuclear weapons against each other. Another very disturbing thing happens to the United States in 1949, and that is when China falls to the communists. There's a general who had fought with the Allies during World War II against the Japanese, Chiang Kai-shek, and he's a federalist, and he's trying to sustain a China against the attacks of Mao Zedong and these communist-led rebels. And here's another interesting example, because we know that Chiang Kai-shek is not a good guy. Everybody knows this. He's kind of a brutal generalissimo in his own way. He just happens to be an ally of the United States. And you have an example here where the United States is forced to support someone we know is scum, we know is a horrible person, we know is willing to fix elections, is willing to kill people, is willing to do all of this almost gangster type stuff to stay in power, but the United States is forced to support him because he's not a communist. If someone is a horrible, brutal dictator, they're not the best choice of someone to kind of hitch your wagon to make your best buddy and your best ally. But you obviously, if you're the United States and you're dealing with these issues of Eastern Europe and Soviet pressure, you can't turn to communist China and make nice with them. So the United States is actually forced into a position where they're defending Chiang Kai-shek against communist encroachment in China. And Mao himself is a military genius. His book about guerrilla warfare is one of the best works on the subject that has ever been written by man. He's an absolute tactical genius. He's a political genius as well. He's also an incredibly brutal, savagely brutal dictator, cut from the very same cloth as Joseph Stalin. Now, Mao is able to consolidate power over China and basically runs the game on the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, and eventually forces them in 1949 right off the continent, physically drives them literally out of China. And the nationalists flee to an island offshore, which is called Taiwan. At the time, they called it the island of Formosa. Now we call it Taiwan. And you can probably find stuff in your house made in Taiwan, and the nationalists are still there to this day. And China still claims the island of Taiwan as part of its territory, but it is defended by the remnants of this kind of nationalist Chinese, which is left over from World War II. And every single year, almost, the Taiwanese government goes before the UN and requests to be recognized as their own nation, and the UN continuously says no, because if the United Nations were to recognize Taiwan as their own country, it would force the United Nations into war with China. And the Cold War is over. For good or ill, it's over. It's done with. But right now, this very moment, we're still dealing with the effects that this still has in the world. Following World War II, the United States reorganizes itself in terms of the Allies. They form a military alliance, which is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. And part of the reason that this is being set up is directly linked to fear over the spread of communism and the fall of China to Mao Zedong and the rest of the communists there. So now you've got more than half of the land area of the planet is under communist domination. And the United States, while they were allied with Russia during World War II, when Nazi Germany was a bigger threat than communism, now they obviously cannot maintain those alliances with someone who they are nominally or economically and politically at war with, maybe not militarily, but economically certainly. They can't maintain that alliance, and so the NATO alliance is most of the former allies from World War II, with the exception of Soviet Russia and those satellite states that they've been able to set up in their quote-unquote buffer zone in Eastern Europe. And NATO is still around with us around today. It's a source of constant tension with Russia. With the latest presidential campaign, there was talk of people leaving NATO and the questions about the nature of this alliance, whatever. It's still an organization that is around with us around today. And I love this map because it basically shows you in two very simple colors how this Cold War world kind of locks itself in place. So the blue is the United States and her allies. Now this is obviously Europe, doesn't show the United States, but just picture the United States off on the left someplace being the color blue, and all of these other states are allies to the United States. Now the red on the far right is the Soviet Union, and you can see those buffer states right along the eastern edge. And then of course you can see right in the dead center, East and West Germany, split right down the middle, the west side occupied by communist Soviets, and the east side occupied by communists, and the west side occupied by the former allies in World War II, France, Great Britain, and the United States. And you can see very clearly that the Soviet Union has set up that buffer zone, but also this alliance, this NATO alliance, gives a buffer zone to the allies as well. So as communism becomes more powerful and becomes this major military force, the places like England and France are scared out of their mind that they could be invaded next. There's no country in Europe or Asia with a army as physically as powerful as the Soviet Union. And so what happens if they get a wild hair one day and decide to just get in their tanks and drive to the west? Really, there's nothing militarily that's going to stop them before they get to the English Channel. And so this NATO alliance is set up as to also create this buffer space right through Germany for France and the United Kingdom, in much the same way that the Soviet Union wants a buffer space. So now you've got these two incredibly heavily armed groups that are kind of looking at each other across this divide right in Germany. And the NATO powers have the United States armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. And the Soviet Union is, of course, armed to the teeth with all kind of nuclear weapons as well. And you can see that this is what creates that tension, this world locked into this rigid jigsaw puzzle of states that are completely incompatible politically, ideologically, language-wise. I mean, it just creates the tension that goes on during the Cold War. And the fear of communism, I've said it over and over and over again, how powerful a motivator fear is, driving people's behavior and making them react in certain ways. You can see this very clearly in the United States in the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s. One of the best examples is the establishment of the Committee of Un-American Activities. And basically these congressional groups end up with virtually carte blanche to kind of root out communists in the United States. And you can see that's being played very cleverly in this cartoon by Herblock. And they're driving down the sidewalk and they're running people over left and right, and they're saying, "Don't worry, it's okay, we're hunting communists," meaning that, you know, the drive to find communists is so strong, so powerful, that they're willing to almost disrupt or destroy some of these kind of freedoms that we enjoy in the West under the Constitution in order to preserve us from communist encroachment or attack by communism. And you get little cute catchphrases like better dead than red. Red being, of course, the color that has always been associated with socialism and communism in particular. In this mix, this very fearful political stew that's going on in the United States, one very important politician begins his career. And this is a man named Richard Nixon, eventually goes on to become known as Tricky Dicky or Tricky Dick. And he starts out as a low-level politician, but becomes a major player in this very anti-communist, almost witch hunt that's going on in the United States at this time. And he really makes a name for himself just savagely attacking communism. And I included on Georgia View a clip from his speech about Checkers. There was Checkers is the dog that he's holding there on the right-hand side. And there were some questions about whether he had used some campaign finances inappropriately or something like that. And he went on TV and he used this as an advantage, and he kind of morphed this questions about how wrong it was for him to accept a pet dog into a political platform that he used to attack his opponents. And you can see, if you just look at the tone of voice, look at the body language that Nixon is using when he's talking about communism, and you can see he's playing to those fears, and he's talking a language that people are clearly going to understand in this kind of fearful atmosphere. So keep Nixon fresh in the back of your mind, because we're going to be talking a lot more about him as we go on. But this is where he really gets his political career really begins to gain traction, is right here in the 1950s fighting communists. Joseph McCarthy is one of the other figures, and there's a whole section in the reading that I provided you with about him. I'm not going to go into a lot of great detail about him. He's a politician from Wisconsin, and almost makes, he takes his desire to stomp out communism to an illogical, almost absurd extreme, to the point where they're accusing everybody of all kind of things. But they go through Hollywood, blacklisting actors, they take on generals, they take on politicians, and they're using this whole thread of rooting out communism to destroy people politically. And it definitely gets out of hand under Joseph McCarthy. But again, I'm not attaching morality to what he did. I'm just trying to get you to see just how powerful a motivator fear can be for someone who is able to exploit it, just like McCarthy does. And Joseph McCarthy is a different person than Douglas MacArthur, the general that we've been talking about. We'll talk more about MacArthur, the general, in just a second, but don't be surprised if you see some kind of exam or quiz question asking you about the two. Don't get them confused, because they're two very, very different people. The United States actually goes so far in this time period, this Red Fear era, to produce pamphlets and literature helping you to identify communism, encouraging you to kind of keep an eye on your neighbor a little bit. And you can actually write to the War Department, and they will send you booklets teaching you all about communism and what to look out for. And so this whole society from top to bottom has got this great fear of communism in it. And this great fear of communism builds and reinforces a lot of the political decisions and a lot of the military and economic decisions the United States is making going forward right from the 1950s. The first major military test of containment happens actually in the Korean on the Korean Peninsula at the end of World War II. And I explained how there's all of these unresolved questions at the end of World War II about what in the hell are we going to do with all of these countries that are occupied by, in some cases, these countries are occupied by 3 different other countries, or half of the country is occupied by communists and half of the country is occupied by capitalists. Some of them are sympathetic to the United States, some of them are sympathetic to communists, some of them are sympathetic to rebels in the middle. How do you sort out this mess? Really, the Korean War is kind of the first time this blows up into a major military fight. So in the early summer of 1950, North Koreans, which are backed by communists, invade South Korea, which are backed by the United States, in an effort to reunite all of the Korean Peninsula under one government, hopefully a communist government, but in order to put the country into less than 2 pieces and make it one whole nation. And the North Koreans very nearly succeed. They actually drive the South Korean army all the way to the very extreme southeastern tip of the Korean Peninsula. And it's only the sudden rush of Marines and kind of reserve army units that were just happened to be stationed in Japan to the Pusan perimeter that stops North Korea from just wiping out South Korea in this surprise attack. And you can see that in the map here, how, look at the dates. It happens very, very quickly that they drive all of the allies. And when I say allies here, I mean the United States, the members of the UN and the South Korean Army. Drive them right down into the bottom of that peninsula. Now, the general in charge of the occupation of Japan is Douglas MacArthur, and we talked about him going all the way back to the destruction of the Bonus Army in Washington, D.C. during the Great Depression. So MacArthur comes over from Japan. He brings troops with him, and they begin to retake the Korean Peninsula. So he launches an invasion at Incheon, and then the units of the United States Marines and the U.S. Army go north, and they're counterattacked by the Chinese. So the Chinese are powerful enough to drive the Allies, the United States, and the UN forces right back to the 38th parallel, basically within miles, and in some cases right exactly where the war started 3 years earlier. You can see in this photograph, you've got U.S. Army trucks that are crossing the 38th parallel as they're driving back the North Koreans. The counterattack against the North Koreans was a smashing success and was the beginning of a major push that basically destroyed the North Korean army. This is the Marine Corps landing at Incheon, South Korea, and this landing should not have succeeded. It really demonstrates the tactical genius of Douglas MacArthur, and we're talking about a man who has been in the military a long, long time, but he was able to look at the situation and come up with a plan. And the landing in this one particular place in South Korea is one of those things that the Marine Corps is very, very proud of, because it's a total success and results in the almost complete destruction of the North Korean army. The soldier in the very center, who's looking back toward the camera, who's standing there with one hand on that ladder, the little hooked object in the center, he is the first Marine over the seawall at Incheon. He's also the first Marine casualty. He was shot dead coming out of the landing craft. And if you look at the equipment that they're using, you cannot distinguish the uniforms and weapons, or even the landing craft for that matter, from anything that was used in World War II. I mean, we're not talking about a very long time period between the Korean War and the end of World War II. And there's a total success, again, of the destruction of the North Koreans, and The only thing that stops the complete annihilation of North Korea as a state is the intervention of China. And so you actually end up with United States troops, U.S. Marines and U.S. Army units in direct combat with communist Chinese soldiers. And the Chinese were huge, numbered huge amounts of soldiers on the ground, but they were not as fully and completely equipped as the Americans. Now, here we go again. You see Truman over there on the left-hand side, Mao is on the right, and Syngman Rhee, who was leader of South Korea, he's another one of these guys that is not the best ally for the United States to have. He's kind of another one of these strong men. He's willing to do unscrupulous things to maintain power, and everybody knows it. It's not a secret. He is not the best, nicest guy, but he's reliably anti-communist. In fact, some politicians actually use that phrase, reliably anti-communist. And so the United States is going to support him in South Korea, you know, essentially to the death against communism. And they have to maintain this policy of containment. In 1950, the United States Marine Corps is within shouting distance of the border with China, and that's basically when China decides to enter the war, and it causes what's called the retreat from the Chosin Reservoir. There's a huge reservoir right near the border of China and North Korea, and the Marines are actually cut off and they're forced to retreat from Chosin. And they're able to do so, bringing out their dead and bringing out all of their equipment more or less in good order. It's a fighting retreat the whole time. And the retreat from the Chosin Reservoir is another one of those moments that the United States Marine Corps is extremely proud of. It also demonstrates the high level of esprit de corps in the Marines, that they're able to, under unimaginable conditions of cold and constant assault and privation, that they're able to retreat out of this completely overwhelming, lopsided amount of Chinese soldiers and still make it down to the coast to be relieved by the Army units. And it really is an amazing moment in U.S. military history. And the Chinese favored, a lot of times they favored what was called human wave attacks. Some of their soldiers went into, some of the Chinese soldiers went into combat with no shoes, and you just saw the kind of weather conditions that could be possible in North Korea. In fact, that the winter of 1950 was one of the coldest winters that had been recorded in North Korea up to that point. And so some of these Chinese soldiers lost arms, hands, whole faces, and feet to frostbite. Not all of these troops were armed. They were sent into battle to pick up a soldier of another, pick up a rifle of another soldier who had already been killed and then continue the attack. The Chinese would rely on these loud distraction measures. They would blow bugles as loud as they could and create as much noise to try and terrify the U.S. Army units and the Marines that were up in the hills. And then they launched these huge human wave attacks against these fixed positions. And in some ways, it was a lot like the very early years of World War I, where I've described to you, you have these huge wave attacks against these fixed positions with machine guns, and tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers are just mowed down like grass. And if you remember, all the thousands and thousands of men who died on the first day of the Somme, it's a similar kind of thing happening in these Chinese human wave attacks. But if you can get enough bodies in front of a machine gun position, you can overwhelm it with just sheer force, and that was kind of their essential strategy. It's incredibly brutal. All told, in the 3 years of back and forth fighting, the North Korean army loses 400,000 killed. China loses 600,000 killed. The United States alone loses 36,568 killed, and the UN forces that are attached to they're fighting with the U.S. Army. So some British troops, Australian troops, Canadians, things like that. They lose 3,063 troops. So think about that and think about how long we're talking about. This war started in 1950 and essentially grinds to a halt in 1953. We're talking 3 years to lose 36,000 U.S. soldiers. During the entire Vietnam War, which lasts 20 years, the United States only lost 47,000. So just look at the numbers and you can see just how savage the fighting was in the Korean War. And it was combat absolutely on the kind of World War II format, where you've got machine guns and heavy artillery and just thousands of people being destroyed in these attacks. It goes right back to exactly the kind of combat that people have been familiar with during World War II. Now, of course, the horrible irony of the Korean War is that by 1953, they're right back on the 38th parallel, essentially where the war started, and it just grinds into stalemate. One side is unable to overcome the other one. And if you'll think back in what we've talked about, this has happened before, right? So look at this photograph here and notice that these guys are living in trenches. Now, there's mountains in the background. It's clearly a North Korean, a Korean peninsula landscape. It's not Flanders Field or northern France, but essentially it's kind of the same trench warfare. So with one side unable to overcome the other one, the Korean War ends in a stalemate. Now, stalemate does not mean the war is over. There's an armistice. That means the shooting has stopped, the war has not. And this is the way that the Korean War sits to this very day. And I challenge you to sit at home tonight and listen to 20 minutes of the evening news and not hear some kind of a comment about militarism in North Korea. We are still trying to sort out this ridiculous mess right down to the very present. And technically speaking, South Korea, the United States, is still at war with North Korea. Now, what makes warfare at the scale of the Korean War so dangerous is the fact that now you're not dealing exclusively with military and political powers that are armed with conventional weapons. By July of 1945, the United States is a nuclear power. Mostly due to the efforts of this man right here, Oppenheimer. He's called the father of the atomic bomb. And he's able to bring together scientists and military technicians and engineers to build an atomic bomb. The theoretical underpinnings of atomic weapons have been around for a long time before World War II. But he's able to, by the 16th of July, 1945, produce a physical device capable of detonation. Now, this photograph is taken during the first test of an atomic bomb. And now this is atomic bomb, not atomic device. An atomic device is a totally different thing. This is designed to be, this is the prototype for an actual bomb. It's exploded on the 16th of July, 1945. And this is, unfortunately, for people that hate dates in history, this is just one of those dates you really need to commit to memory. Because everything about the world, there's certain moments where everything changes. And I don't mean that to sound trite, but on the 16th of July, 1945, the world enters the atomic age with all of the benefits to society that come along with splitting the atom and all of the problems that come along with the runaway development of atomic weapons. So this photograph is actually out in the desert of New Mexico. This is where the test is, the first atomic explosion. And this is just 15 seconds after the initial blast. And you can see the scale there. We're talking about a very, very powerful device. And the early atomic bombs were firecrackers compared to what we've produced today. So from the 16th of July to August, they managed to get 2 more devices and get them to the Pacific Theater for use against the Japanese. And remember what I said, I don't want you focusing too much on dates except for the ones that I really tell you to pay attention to. But the first use of the atomic bomb against someone in war is the bombing of Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945. We've already talked about this. We've got an image in our mind thanks to movies like Terminator, where the atomic bomb goes off and it blasts the skin right off people's body and everything else. And I showed you all of the reading from Barefoot Gen. These are horrible, horrible weapons, and they do unbelievable damage, and they do horrible things to people's body. People do survive them, and the problem with the early weapons is they're kind of small enough and enough people survive the initial attack that they're considered legitimate weapons. Something that, yes, it's horrible, but isn't war itself horrible? And we should never get into a position where we have to use these weapons. But if we do, there will be people that survive. It's not like you blast a hole in the universe and all life as we know it ends. And look at this map of Hiroshima. So everything in red is completely destroyed, as in down to the ground, toothpicks and chunks of rubble destroyed. And the rings around it show other damage, but you can see there are parts of the city that are outside the blast that don't suffer fire. There's issues, of course, with radiation, and I'm not saying it's a safe thing to be around, but it's containable, it's survivable. You could potentially use these against other cities. And so this is a very dangerous idea to accept these weapons as just part of a normal arsenal. Yeah, it's a horrible weapon, it's very powerful, but we're going to go ahead and include them in what we normally field when we have a combat unit. Immediately, the United States Army and the Atomic Energy Commission began to do a series of tests of atomic bombs to really see what they got. If you think about the dates between the test, the Trinity test, and the use of the atomic bomb against Japan, we're talking about basically a month, a little bit less than a month's worth of time. And these are actually used in combat, from a functional device to something that you drop out of a plane on somebody. So scientists really need to get a handle on what we've actually created here. So they go way out in the Pacific in these really remote atolls, and they set up some tests. And there's a series of tests called Operation Crossroads. And if you look around the bottom of that mushroom cloud, you'll see little black shapes. Those are surplus military vessels left over from World War II. Aircraft carriers, battleships, and things like that. And what the scientists do is they set up all kind of recording equipment, all kind of scientific measuring instruments, and then they bomb the hell out of these ships that are anchored in the Bikini Atoll. And these produce some of the most iconic photographs of atomic explosions. And anytime you see a music video and there's atomic explosions, I guarantee you the picture they're going to go to first is from Operation Crossroads, most likely this specific test, which was called Baker. It's used over and over and over again in films about the dangers of atomic weapons, etc. It's just so photogenic. You got this beautiful landscape in the foreground, and then somebody's bombing the hell out of it. So, but look at the power that's being displayed here. So, in the previous lecture, I talked a lot about the power of warships and things like that. That dark spot on the right-hand side of that mushroom cloud is a battleship standing up on end in the mushroom cloud. So you've got scientists that are trying to figure out how do we weaponize and make this something that's a viable weapon that we can use over and over and over again. So the military has very clear ideas about where they want to go with this device. And because this is televised, because there's all of these newsreels, all these photographs, these very iconic photographs, people begin to internalize atomic weapons as parts of culture. So instead of it just being a weapon, it's so new, it's so fascinating that people latch onto it as kind of a neat and trendy thing. The best example I can give you of that, well, actually there's two really good examples, but this will be the first one, is there's a series of beauty pageants in 1946 where they crown Miss Atomic Bomb. And you can see here she is wearing her little bathing suit that's in the shape of an atomic cloud. And they would hold these events out in Las Vegas. And from the second-story balconies of some of the hotels, you could actually see atomic detonations out in the desert as they were doing these tests. And people would plan their family vacations so that they would be in Las Vegas in time to get up on the balcony or get up on the roof and actually see a mushroom cloud, 60 miles off in the desert or however far away it was. And the rush to create and incorporate these weapons and these devices into American life really results in this kind of, people are almost treating it like it's a new toy. Americans absolutely love new technology. And the instant that there's some new stupid iPod or some new phone or something like that, everybody runs down to the mall to buy the new device. And this is the same kind of reaction that you're seeing here. People are impressed by the power of this thing. They're looking at this as a symbol of American might and how impressive and how powerful it is. And look at the look on her face. This is all fun and games to these people in the 1940s. And there's almost a complete lack of respect for how powerful and how dangerous these things are. And maybe this, I should say, is the best example of how this kind of percolates down into American society. Before 1946, you didn't really have a two-piece bathing suit that was an official kind of wardrobe, but after 1946, you end up with the bikini. And the photograph on the right is the first fashion photograph showing the bikini, quote-unquote bikini. And the designer is this bespectacled man over there on the left. He's actually a Frenchman, but the bikini is named after this place where these atomic tests are going on. Why? Because it's a word that is in the public dialogue. It's out there. It is something people are talking about constantly. It's kind of a unique and weird word. And so why not tie your new invention to something that's got that kind of word of mouth? Now, let's be very clear. I think it's obvious, and I don't mean this in a sexist way, but I think it's obvious to see why what the appeal of the bikini is, particularly to men, right? So the bikini was probably going to be popular. You could have called it the ham sandwich, and it probably would have been popular for, just by virtue of its nature. But still, think about the marketing power of naming it after something that's in the news and that everybody's paying attention to and everybody's looking at and thinking about and talking about around the water cooler. And you can see how this has just dumped itself right into American culture. And it's all fine and good. It's all wonderful, this kind of total lack of respect and treating the atomic bomb as a novelty, etc., right up until 1949. And that's because the Soviet Union figures out how to weaponize and create their own atomic bomb. So in the plains of Kazakhstan, the Soviets explode their own atomic bomb. And it's codenamed by the American military and the CIA, Joe 1. I honestly don't know what the Soviet name for it is. I could probably look it up somewhere. But suddenly, because the Soviets have this device, it's not a joking matter anymore. It's not something that is kind of trivialized and treated without respect, because now your sworn political, economic, and sociological enemy has the same device that you do, this incredibly destructive power. And you can see the effect that the development of this weapon by the Soviets has instantaneously in American society. By 1951, we've gone straight from the bikini to civil defense videos teaching children how to survive an atomic attack. And I've included the 1951 duck and cover film. It's 9-10 minutes long, something like that. I really strongly suggest that you go and watch it. I can almost guarantee you that there's going to be questions about this on the quiz and the exam. But what you've done is you've gone from one extreme to the other, taken something that is the subject of beauty pageants and scandalous bathing suits to something that you're using that's so frightening that you're teaching children in schools how to survive these attacks. And the problem is that the whole idea of duck and cover is really, there really is no adequate response to having an atomic bomb dropped on you. There's not much you can do in terms of protecting yourself. And this is actually demonstrated by Bert the Turtle in the video. And if you watch very closely, you can see there's a scene where a guy drops to the ground and he covers his head with newspaper. And I've actually seen other civil defense videos that tell you to lay on the ground and cover yourself, shield yourself with newspaper. It's insane. It doesn't make any sense. But the idea that there is something you can do, there is a response, as maladaptive and preposterous as the idea of covering yourself with newspaper to protect yourself from an atomic bomb, it begins to blunt some of those fears that people have about these devices. And of course, it's just totally absurd. But again, you can see the effect this is having in American society. So the atomic bomb is great, wonderful. But now the Soviets have the same thing. Now what are we going to do? So 1952, this man, Edward Teller, rushes to help the United States develop the next level of nuclear weapon, and that is the hydrogen bomb. And there's a very clear difference between an atomic bomb and a hydrogen bomb. A hydrogen bomb is a thermonuclear device. They all use atomic energy and breaking apart elements to create heat and pressure. But a hydrogen bomb is tens of thousands of times more powerful than an atomic device. And Edward Teller is the father of the hydrogen bomb. And so 1952, the United States, way out in the Pacific, yet again, they test their first thermonuclear device. Now, a thermonuclear device is not a weapon. A weapon is something you can put on an airplane and deliver to a target, or put in a rocket and shoot at a target. A device is something that you build in a lab. But the first thermonuclear detonation, codenamed Mike, happens in a place called Inuviatok Atoll in 1952. The United States manages to create a weaponed version of this by 1954, and you notice the name again, they're back in bikini now, and they set off a weaponized thermonuclear explosion codenamed Bravo in 1954. This is the Bikini Atoll. I forget exactly when this photograph was taken, but the photograph there is less than 6-8 years old, I think. So from the explosion in 1954, you can see the crater that's left in the island. That huge blue dot in the center of the photograph is the blast where all of the coral and everything else was vaporized by the 15 megaton explosion of the Bravo test. Now, Bravo in 1954 was an actual weapon, and that's all fine and good. The United States was able to produce a weaponized version of the thermonuclear weapon, the hydrogen bomb. The problem is the Soviets beat the United States to the punch by 1 year. So here we are back in Kazakhstan, and the Soviets, instead of building a device first and working out all of the particulars of creating the weapon first, they went straight to the weapons phase. So the explosion is codenamed Joe 4, but they beat the United States to a deliverable weapon. So there's not this great gap of time between the creation of the atomic bomb and the Soviet Union catching up this time. There's no gap at all. There's no time period where the United States and citizens in the United States can feel good about themselves because they have some technology that the Soviet Union does not, that they can lord it over the Soviet Union, that they can treat it like a, it doesn't become this same object of disrespect, because by the time the United States has a bomb that they can field, the Soviets are already putting it onto bombers. Now, here's another one of the big differences between a hydrogen bomb and an atomic bomb. The only thing that affects the power of a hydrogen bomb is the ability to create the weapon. So, in theory, there's no upper limit to the size of a hydrogen bomb. You just have to be able to build a plane big enough to get it off the ground. Whereas with an atomic bomb, because of the physics involved, there's kind of an upper limit of the size of an atomic bomb. Hydrogen bombs, you can just continue to build until theoretically you could build one big enough to explode the entire planet. And up into the time period we're talking about, 1940s, 1950s, right up into the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union continue to develop steadily bigger and more powerful hydrogen bombs, kind of as a way of talking to each other, of demonstrating their power. And the biggest one of these bombs ever developed is known as the Tsar Bomba. It's a 50 megaton hydrogen bomb which has exploded way, way up above the Arctic Circle in the Soviet Union. And this photograph is taken of that explosion, and this was an airburst, so it's not like something that was dropped on the ground. But that fireball that you see in that photograph is 5 miles across, and it hasn't touched the ground yet. So think of the power that you're talking about with this device. And this is, of course, a genuinely terrifying weapon of immense scale, but it is not even the biggest one that you could theoretically build. So this graph should help you understand it, right? So on the left, you'll see the Hiroshima and Trinity mushroom clouds. It shows the power of the bombs. And then if you look, that circle on the left of the graph, right next to Mike and Bravo, shows how powerful those explosions are. And those are about maxed out. That's about as powerful as you're going to get with an atomic weapon. But look at how tiny, how minuscule they are compared to Mike and Bravo, which were devastatingly powerful weapons. And then compare that to the size of the Tsar Bomba that's detonated in 1961. So you're talking about weapons that you can't rationalize. You can potentially rationalize a bomb the size of the Hiroshima bomb. And even beside the Hiroshima bomb is the modern day atomic weapons that we have today, the kind of bunker buster type nuclear weapons. Tiny little minuscule things, almost precision weapons. You can live in a world where somebody, yes, if war got bad enough, if things were horrible enough, you might actually use atomic weapons against each other at the scale of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and maybe even Trinity, right? And you could rationalize that. People would survive. It would be horrible, but everybody would rebuild. If war breaks out and the weapons are the size of Bravo, Mike, and the Soviet bombs, you can't live in that world. These things are powerful enough to literally destroy civilization. And so you're left with, how do you rationalize, how do you internalize this thing being built and being out there in the world, right? So go back to thinking about fear again, right? And what does this mean for people that are experiencing these things? So the United States begins to build these hydrogen bombs after the tests in the Bravo test is kind of the successful test that demonstrates the technology is sound and we can build these devices. And ironically, what happens is the blast is so powerful. There's a Japanese fishing boat a couple of 100 miles downwind of the test site in Bikini. And it's just a little old fishing boat called the Lucky Dragon No. 5. And this is the boat that's been preserved in a museum in Japan. And its crew is out there fishing, minding their own business. They're so far away they cannot see or feel any of the blast effects. What they're exposed to is just fallout from all that pulverized coral that's coming out of that crater that I showed you, where everything just gets smashed in that atomic, or in that nuclear cloud, and then spread all over creation by the winds. And this is a photograph of one of the crew members that is exposed to that radioactive dust and coral that's falling out of the sky onto this fishing trawler, and horribly, horribly burned. The crew suffers intense radiation sickness, and they're hundreds of miles away from this device, right? So these guys, which are hundreds and hundreds of miles away from a hydrogen bomb, are burned this badly, even killed, right? And think about the author of Barefoot Gen. He was in the same city they dropped an atomic bomb on, and he lived to be an old man, lived to have a career as an author, as an artist, as an illustrator, and to pursue his own political career, his own political life. But how do you rationalize? How do you live with a world, live in and with a world where this thing can do this to you from hundreds of, so far away you can't even see the flash or feel the ground shake? How does that fear manifest itself in the world? How do people rationalize this? And I hate to break it to you, but one of the ways that it actually demonstrated itself is in the creation of a whole genre of movies in the 1950s. And at the very top of the list is the movie Godzilla. And I can tell, I can just almost hear everybody giggling to themselves right now, because how ridiculous is Godzilla. And in our modern day, without any context, you might think, sure, yeah, Godzilla is ridiculous. It's a guy in a rubber suit. But look at the year. There's absolutely no coincidence that Godzilla is created in the year 1954, the same year as the hydrogen detonation that burned all of those sailors. It's no coincidence, no mistake of fate that this creature, which is built upon fears of atomic destruction, comes out of a country that has been bombed once and has also experienced the media hype surrounding all of these burned sailors. And I've included on Georgia View the original movie trailer for Godzilla. And I want you to watch it. And to our modern sensibilities, it looks ridiculous. But look at what's going on and the things they're saying about the creature in that trailer. Listen to the way it's described, and look at the way it's destroying the world, and you can see the metaphor as clear as a bell of what they're actually saying. They're not actually talking about a giant rubber lizard. They're talking about these devices which have been turned loose on civilization that could literally destroy us. And those are the actual words that they use to describe it in that trailer. My absolute favorite of the entire genre, though, is a movie called Them, which is about radioactive ants. And these ants are grown to ridiculous proportions by atomic tests out in the desert. Okay? Again, look at the year. We're talking 1954. There is absolutely no coincidence that this happens in 1954. And there's a great speech included in this movie where the head scientist, who's trying to figure out what in the hell do we do about these giant ants, talks about how this could be the end of human civilization and mankind may no longer be the dominant life form on this planet. He's not talking about ants. The ants are just the metaphor. That's what they're using to explain these fears away to people. I've also included the trailer for them, and I really want you to look at both of them and think about the metaphor that they're actually saying. I guarantee you there will be questions about both these movies on the quiz and the exam. I guarantee you.